Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, Osazeecorner. I'm Osaze, and today I have an interesting topic that I would like to discuss with you. I brought out the turtleneck today, so we're about to have some serious grown folk discussion. Hold on, actually. Let me get the spectacles. Let's go. Now we're good. Oh no, it's giving 70s vibe. Or is it 80s? One of the two, 70s or 80s. I never know exactly decades in fashion. They're always all jumbled up in my head. I only know the 90s, but hey. But yeah, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time, please do not forget to subscribe and like. Drop a comment if you have a comment. Your subscribing and your liking will help the channel grow, and I will be eternally grateful for you for supporting. So thank you very much, and I hope you find some useful information and enjoy the video. And before we get into the video, scent of the day is the classic masterpiece from Roja Parfums, Oligarch, which is such a beautiful fragrance. Just today I found out that the extrait version of this fragrance has been released, and I'm like, Roja, man, don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. I can't buy this shit right now, but hopefully someday soon, before the end of the year, I'll be able to get my hands on Oligarch Parfum Extrait. And I think the other Parfum is probably discontinued now. It's no longer on the website, but hey, hopefully in the future I'll be able to buy that fragrance and do a review with the Eau de Parfum, a classic fragrance. I've heard this term used. We've all used this term. We've used it to describe and define a fragrance. And no one, to the best of my knowledge, has ever done a video to sort of deep dive into it and what is a classic fragrance, what constitutes a classic fragrance. But honestly, in my research, what I found is it's quite not as clear as I thought it would be. So I came out of my research having some more questions than answers. While there is a universal feel and understanding of what it means, there is still some personal room for subjectivity in defining what a classic fragrance is. Now, if we're talking about what fragrance is a classic, now that's a whole different, discussion. You can have arguments on what is a classic and not. It's like Ronaldo versus Messi, who's better? Jordan versus LeBron, who's better? That's a whole different discussion. The question in today's video and what I try to approach to answer is, what is a classic fragrance? What constitutes a classic fragrance? So back to the topic at hand, classic fragrances. What is a classic fragrance? So when I did my research, we have to start from the basic. What do you define as classic? I'm just going to pull up the definition of classic on Google over here. So according to Google, classic is judged over a period of time to be of the highest quality and outstanding of its kind. So when we talk about classic in terms of art and fragrance as being part of art, and in more research, what I found is that there were three elements that were constant in my research. The first is time. The work has to have had some time out. It has to have been released for a period of time, and it has to have universal appeal amongst people, as attesting to the quality and the level of craftsmanship, and is it universally realized as one of the best works? Just because I say universally doesn't mean every single person has to agree to the fragrance being great. If most people say this work is great universally, then it qualifies. It doesn't have to be 100% because nothing is 100%. And then the third is it has to have an impact in the culture that it is invested into. In terms of fragrance, it has to have some kind of impact in the culture of fragrances. Now, those are three pretty good, well-defined criteria for you to go ahead and say, okay, does this fragrance, has it stood the test of time? Does it have a universal appeal? And then does it have impact in the culture? Looking into those three criteria, I started coming up with some shortcomings, not shortcomings, but questions that I was coming against. And what I found out is some people do not consider the time element for a fragrance to be that much important to judging if something is a classic. I disagree, because you need time to see how it does over time for the fragrance, how people across probably a generation at least, or a couple generations, how people across time appreciate the fragrance. If the fragrance is hot today and everyone loves it today and it's, selling as crazy, and in 5-10 years time, no one cares about it, it doesn't smell good, it smells out of place, I'm sorry, I cannot call that a classic, because it smells out of place. It's more of a contemporary fragrance to a specific time. It's more restricted to a specific time. It doesn't pass the time aspect. But I found out that some people do not consider the time element as important. But if we do consider time as an important aspect, how much time in terms of fragrances do we need? I looked this up again in other objects, and the only object that sort of had like a defined time frame were cars. And that is because there is a element of insurance in terms of insuring and valuing cars. And in that essence, it said at least 20 years before a car is considered a classic, but no longer than 40 years before the car is considered an antique. So if you look at it in fragrances, I think it's unfair to say a fragrance has to stand the test of time for 20 years. With a lot of the laws changing in terms of ingredients, IFRA changing, the amount and doses and what ingredients, it would undoubtedly affect some fragrances more than others. Take example, oak moss, of how it was used when Mitsuoko was created is nothing like today. So it's unfair to compare any sort of modern interpretation of Mitsuoko to back in the day. But then if you ask me personally, what would I say? I would say somewhere between 10 and 20 years. If a fragrance was released 10, 20 years ago and it was popular back then and successful back then, and it is still popular and successful and still widely regarded as a great art piece, a great creation, then I think it's fair to call it a classic. And that really opens the door for a lot of fragrance to be considered a classic. But if you take a more steep approach, like some people do, because one thing I found out that when people refer to something as a classic, they only think of things that smell vintage, which isn't the case for me. I think a fragrance like Terre Hermes, Creed Aventus, both fragrances, to me, are classics, but they don't smell vintage. They are very contemporary smelling. Now, give it another 40, 50 years, see where fragrances are. Would they smell vintage? I don't know. I don't think so. Because there are some really old fragrances that I smell today and I still feel like, okay, this fragrance is still a classic fragrance. I'm thinking of Giorgio Armani Pour Homme. It is a wonderful citrus, woody, spicy fragrance. Now the question is, they do stand the test of time, but they don't meet the other criteria. Like some of them might not have that cultural impact in fragrances. Does that not mean that they're not classic? Now, there's one thing in considering a fragrance classic, and then another thing to consider the smell a classic. So that is how I ended up settling on the idea that, okay, you can have a classic smelling fragrance, like Giorgio Armani Pour Homme, but it's not a classic fragrance because it doesn't have that cultural impact that something like Mitsuoko does. Mitsuoko is a classic fragrance. It has the cultural impact, it has stood the test of time, and it is widely regarded as a great, work of art. And that, when you look at classic in that sort of definition, you find out that there probably aren't many classics, but there are a bunch of classic smelling fragrances. So if I was to list a couple of classics, I would say Guerlain Vetiver is a classic fragrance that has spawned a lot of classic smelling fragrances like Roja Vetiver, Tom Ford's Grey Vetiver. And those fragrances smell classic, but I wouldn't consider them a classic fragrance because while they, meet the criteria of great craftsmanship, classic smelling, because they're pretty much piggybacking off something that was successful, those fragrances, Grey Vetiver and Roja Vetiver, do not have that cultural impact like Guerlain Vetiver does. So Guerlain Vetiver, Guerlain Mitsuoko, Green Irish Tweed, you can argue is a classic. I'm not totally sold on that. I'm still on, I don't know, but I wouldn't argue too much against someone calling it a classic. Creed Aventus, I will call a classic. Now, the one fragrance that, this might be a hot take, but I don't think Baccarat Rouge by Maison Francis Kurkdjian is a classic. I think that would be regarded as a contemporary fragrance. I fear that Baccarat Rouge, right now, as popular as it is, over the 6-7 years it's been released, in the next 30-40 years, I think we'll be looking at Baccarat Rouge the same way we look today at Dracar Noir or Yop Homme. It will smell like an era of the past. It wouldn't feel like it belonged in that time. But I could be wrong on that. But I don't think it smells classic. I feel like after a certain generation goes and the next generation smells it, it'll be one of those, ooh, this smells like my grandma fragrance. I feel like that's where Baccarat Rouge is going. In terms of classic fragrances in women's, a lot of the chypres that are unisex, and especially the ones that are floral, when you add like the floral or the aldehydic angle, like Chanel No. 5, that is a classic. It is a chypre floral, a floral chypre that has soapy aldehydic facets. I think one of the main building blocks for classic fragrance in terms of women is citrus top, floral mids, usually white floral mids, and a musky base. And that is like the bare bones on how a classic women's fragrance is created. What do you think about that? Do you agree that there are classic fragrances and then fragrances that smell classic? And what is your definition of a classic fragrances? Do you feel like the fragrance needs to, stand the test of time across generation, or just a 10-year period or 20-year period? What? And do you feel like it needs to have some kind of impact in the culture for it to be considered a classic? These are the questions that I am leaving for you guys to leave in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was really fun for me to bring it to you. And thank you again. Have a good day and goodbye.